have with me today Sam Smith, author of the Progressive Review, as well as several books, Why Bother, and Sam Smith's Great American Political Repair Manual. He co-founded Commercial Alert, is that correct, with Gary Ruskin?
Well, it was on the board.
You now sit on the board of directors of greenchange.org?
That's right.
And you're one of the founding members of the Green Party?
That's true.
And probably one of the first bloggers on planet Earth.
Yeah, I think of myself as a pre-blogger.
Uh-huh.
I still call it an online journal because I never liked the term blog.
Uh-huh.
Actually, the first person to use that term was a fellow named Jorn Barger, who's still online. And he's the one who deserves the credit.
For those who aren't familiar, what is the Progressive Review?
The Progressive Review it's had various names over the years. It started in 1964 as sort of a pre-underground publication. At that time, there weren't many publications of that sort around. There was the Carolina Israelite, there was the Village Voice, there was the Realist, Paul Krasner's Realist, but there were only about 5 or 6. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. I started out, and then a few years later, the underground press came along, and I found my home. And by the end of the 60s, there were maybe 400 underground papers around the country.
Nice.
And but life moves on, and now I'm only online. I was in print for about 40 years. And now I'm just online at prorev.com.
And so when did you go to web only?
Early this decade, before the newspapers started to get hysterical about, print media. I already sensed things were changing. And sometimes when you're smaller, you got to move faster.
What moved you to start writing?
That's a hard question. I come from a family of 6 children. I had my first publication. It was a family newspaper when I was 13, I think.
Was that a family that was
My
distributed within your family?
Within my brothers and sisters and my parents. And it had such leading stories as how come my littlest sister got to ride her bicycle in the house when none of the rest of us had been allowed. Things like that. So I was into investigative reporting early. And then I was editor of my high school, co-editor of my high school yearbook, and I then was news director of my college radio station, and then went into radio news for a number of years.
What did you do other than just the Progressive Review? What other work have you done?
I've done a lot of freelance work. For a number of years, I was, of all things, the American correspondent for the Illustrated London News. I was involved in running a radio station for quite a few years, helping to run a radio station, a classical music station, which is a pretty strange occupation for a jazz musician. But, so I've done a variety of things.
What was Commercial Alert?
Well, Commercial Alert was an attempt to deal with the growing tendency of corporations to sort of intrude in our communities, in our schools, in our social lives. Everything from naming stadiums after corporations, mm-hmm. or having our food in our schools be essentially as bad as what you'd find at a local fast food place. Mm-hmm. And Gary Ruskin, who was the head of that organization, did a magnificent job. He was very, very good. It was a very small operation. He has become ill and has had to essentially give up his work, but it was just incredible what he was able to do. As a reporter in Washington, I got to really see who was efficient and who wasn't, in terms of activism. And it was amazing. There were a handful of people who were just terrific, and Gary was one of them. Another who I have immense admiration for is a guy named Rob Ritchie, who started a group called Fair Vote, which is pushing for instant runoff voting, which people in Maine may know about because it's coming to Portland. Mm-hmm. It looks like if the folks approve of it.
Yep.
And Rob was really a fantastic model for an activist, very low-key. I went to the hearing at the Portland Charter Commission, and he was there. And I was struck by how you don't have to shout to get your point across, you know. And he was just absolutely had control of the issue and was very pleasant about it. And he was also very clever. For example, he got colleges to adopt instant runoff voting for their student bodies. And the idea behind that is if you get the students at the college to do it, then when they come out into the real world, you know, they're gonna understand what it is. And they'll be leaders in that world, and it won't be strange. And so we're making a lot of headway on this issue. So it's been one of the pleasures to deal with people like that.
Did you work with Ralph Nader?
I didn't work with him. I've known him for years. My wife actually knew about him before I did, I think, because she was working as a assistant press secretary for the Gaylord Nelson, the senator from Wisconsin. And there weren't many women in that sort of post on the Hill in those days. And she'd come from Wisconsin. She didn't know Washington that well. And they wanted an article on automobile safety, and she didn't know what to do about this. It wasn't exactly her field, so she asked a coworker and said, well, there's a guy who knows all about it, but it's sort of hard to reach because he lives in an apartment and the phone's down the hall and you never know whether you can get him or not. And that was Ralph Nader.
Did you work with Gary Ruskin?
Well, only on Commercial Alert. Some of the other people I worked with over the years, one of them was a fellow named Marion Barry, who later became mayor of Washington. At the time I worked with him, we were both 20-somethings, and he was head of SNCC in Washington.
What is SNCC?
That was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it was a major civil rights movement in the country. And he later became mayor of Washington and then ended up going to jail. But when I was advising him, he did very well. His major fault when I was advising him was that he would show up for events late. And I'd have to convince the reporters that it was worth hanging around. And then I worked for another fellow named Julius Hobson, who was probably the most underrated civil rights leader in our history. He was just incredible, the number of things that he got done with a very, very small group. But because he wasn't part of sort of the civil rights establishment, and the press didn't pay, and because it happened in Washington, which was really considered a colony and not important, you know, that he didn't get the attention. But his name was Julius Hobson, and he said he could cause a revolution with a telephone booth and 5 people, and that was pretty nearly true. One of my favorite stories about Julius Hobson was that he was a noted atheist. And at the end of his life, he had a very long illness. And in fact, we had an event for him at a hotel in Washington. 2,000 people came. Joan Baez came and sang Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. His mother came up from Alabama and said, Go, son, go. And Julius was lying on a couch, smoking a cigar to ease his pain. And I remember as we left, saying to someone, I said, well, what do we do now? Well, Julius already had an answer. He went into remission, ran for the city council, lived another 5 years. And shortly before he died, though, they did a long television interview with him. And one of the questions was, Mr. Hobson, what happens if on your death you find that there is a God? What are you going to say to him? And he said, and he was sitting in a wheelchair, he was all humped over, he said, if I die and find there is a God, here's what I'm going to tell him. Why do you let me have a nice house and a beautiful car and outdoor cooking equipment, and while all these people are suffering all around me? And then he went into this long tirade against God and how he had treated people on earth. And he said, And that's what I would tell God if I find there is one, and if he doesn't like it, to hell with him. And that was one of his final public statements.
To you, what does it mean to be a citizen?
I think being a citizen involves not simply rights, you know, or the power that you have as a citizen, but being part of a community. And one of the things that concerns me right now is that we seem to have lost that concept. There's so much anger in the country, and that doesn't help resolve issues when everybody sort of retreats to their corner. And part of the trick is to get people to understand that we're living in a society where it is inevitable that there will be people that you don't like for one reason or another. Maybe for good reasons, maybe for terrible reasons. But they have just as much right to be here and exercise the same privileges that you do. And if we could build that sensitivity and less of the idea that we have to defeat them or we have to convince them, and it works on both sides. I mean, after all, you take the abortion issue. Both sides of the abortion issue have worked for decades to convince people that they're wrong. And they have failed miserably. So what's the answer? The answer is to accept the fact that you live in a society where some people approve of abortions and some don't. And how do you get along in that sort of society? But that's part of what I think being a citizen is about.
How do you feel about the current debate about the mosque that's to be built near the World Trade Center?
Well, there are a lot of things you can say about that, you know, that are sort of arguing points. You could point out that there have been, since 9/11, quite a few Muslim services in the Pentagon, which was another target. Now, are the critics of the mosque being built there saying that the United States military is unpatriotic for doing that? You know, that's a good question, isn't it? It also assumes that what 19 people have done explains what 2 or 3 million people believe in. And as a white male, I wouldn't want that standard applied by looking at the crime rate, right? You know, because they could say the same thing about me, you know, that I'm a murderer and a rapist and a thief, because look at the statistics.
And a corporate criminal.
And a corporate criminal, yeah, right. So that's the problem, but that goes back to the issue. I mean, and we look at this as inevitable, you know, when people get in this sort of mood, but it's not. And having gone through, I was born in Washington, which people don't really realize these days, but it was very much a southern town. It was sort of the door out of the South into the North. But it had restrictive covenants, it had segregated schools, it had segregated restaurants. So I have physically seen a city change dramatically. You know? And so that I don't see these things as fixed. One of the things that changes people's minds on this issue is, for example, if their son or daughter falls in love with a Muslim. And I think, again, the activists in various movements underestimate the importance of these personal experiences because they think of it as an intellectual matter. But for the average person, it's not. So that's why I think the importance of accepting the fact that there are people you don't agree with or don't even like, but still treating them decently. I mean, it's like my father used to say, he said, you don't have to like your relatives, you just have to be nice to them. Well, that's, I think, applies to all Americans. And if we took that attitude, then we wouldn't get into as many of these fights.
Do you have any political heroes? Or political peers?
I'm a writer. So my standards are a little bit bizarre. Because the people I like are not necessarily the people who are the best you know, and, but they're the people who are the most interesting or the most fun.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly of people I met, I think Eugene McCarthy was one of my favorites. Very funny.
And you
very
met
interesting.
Eugene McCarthy?
Yeah, I used to have lunch with him on a fairly regular basis.
Really?
Yeah, and he was just an awful lot of fun to be around in it. And there were, at the time I started as a reporter in the 1950s in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
the town was just so much more full of interesting politicians than it is today. And it was one of the things that attracted to me politics. You know, it was just too much fun. It was too interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to Harvard, and I was news director of the Harvard radio station, and I got into covering the Cambridge City Council.
Mm-hmm.
And it was right at the end of the James Michael Curley period in Boston, who was mayor of the machine mayor of Boston.
Mm.
And that spirit was still there. And to see it in operation in a smaller place next door, Cambridge, it was just fascinating. You know, to have a council, as a college student, to have a councilman come up to you and say, you know, I don't know how I'm going to vote on this police and fireman pay raise because I've got to figure that every one of them's getting $3,000 or $4,000 more on the side. You know, and he was just taking that as a matter of fact, you know, something you just have to deal with. So that I guess as a writer, I tend to like characters, and I forgive characters if they're interesting. And I also believe, which is not very acceptable, that scoundrels can do a lot of good.
Mm-hmm. How
And
so?
I don't say that as a intellectual argument. I only say it empirically, because I've seen it over and over again. The most good legislation that has been passed in the history of the United States in the shortest periods of time was passed in no small part by Lyndon Johnson and Adam Clayton Powell.
Okay.
And those are not people that you would hold up to your children as role models, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, but they did an awful lot of good. And yet you can have people who are, and one of my complaints with modern liberalism is that it looks very nice on the surface, but it's got no guts.
Mm-hmm. How do you mean?
Well, I mean, it's a polite philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So that people, and if you spend a lot of time in one issue like I did in civil rights, you were very conscious of this, of sort of, and a lot of black activists felt this way, that the white liberals at that time were, you know, they couldn't be relied upon,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in Congress. And so you find this all the time. You have people who sort of act out a role, but if you put them in a job, they're not going to get anything done.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the more complex and confused types like Lyndon Johnson, and what do you get out of it? You get, you know, Medicare, and you get, you know, all sorts of anti-poverty programs, but you also get the war in Vietnam, you see, and you got to live with that. And you got to deal with that. So it's very hard to talk about heroes after you've had the sort of experience I've had.
So, one thing that I know about you is that you say that it's important to have fun in politics. If politics were fun, I mean, when I think politics, I think of, like, you know, board meetings and bad coffee and meetings and, you know, people in suits and
Right.
talking in monotone. If it was fun, wouldn't everyone want to do it?
Well, people used to. I strongly recommend for anybody who's interested in politics the biography of George Washington Plunkett, who was a Tammany Hall figure in the 19th century. And this is a book by a reporter. And you read this book and you realize how different politics have become. When the precinct leaders of Tammany Hall had to meet, they had to rent Madison Square Garden, because I think they had something like 20,000 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And political organizations at that time did not simply provide politics. They just weren't campaign organizations. And in fact, George Washington Plunkett says that if someone brings a new young man to me, I said, I don't worry him with politics, I put him on the baseball team. See, that's the sort of approach they have. And it's something that I've urged the Greens to think more about, is how do you build a community?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the way the old-time politicians used to do it, where, so that even if you didn't win, you had a community that helped supported one another, and it served sort of as a secular church almost for the members.
So do you think things were better for politics back in like Theodore Roosevelt's time when he was governor, or before that?
It was different. I think the high point of sort of modern politics, say of the last 150 years, would have to be the 60s and the New Deal. I mean, they were extraordinary times. And an awful lot got done. My father worked in the New Deal from almost the beginning to work for Truman for a little bit. And so I grew up in that environment. And
what did he do?
well, he was a sort of a mid-level official. He worked in the NRA at first. He helped to write the SEC laws. I came across a memo from him to Tommy Corcoran, who was Roosevelt's top advisor, explaining why a minimum wage would be constitutional. Now, how's that for
Nice.
something, you know, that's sort of hard for us to think that, why did anybody wonder about that? But those were the times.
Huh.
One of the things that strikes me about those times compared to now, looking, say, at the Democratic Party, is the great emphasis on what I call doing the most for the most. And if you go back and you look at, say, the Hillary Clinton campaign or the Obama campaign, there was an incredible lack of emphasis on economic and social needs of the average person. And this isn't their fault, but it reflects, you know, where we are in politics. So I was talking to a class of students of a guy named Peter Edelman, who was one of Bobby Kennedy's top assistants, and he is now a law professor, and he's, you know, knows about as much about politics as anyone you want to meet. And I said to this class, in talking about this, I said, you know, if we had today's politics, we never would have a minimum wage. We would not have Social Security, because we can't do that anymore. And I looked over at Peter, he was nodding his head in agreement. You know? And that's sort of you know, a reflection of where we are. The other thing is that, on the other hand, is that it was much smaller. Roosevelt fought the Depression with a staffs smaller than Hillary Clinton's when she was First Lady. And he fought World War II with a staff smaller than Vice President Gore's. And that's a you know, huge difference. The third difference is, I think, the advent of television. I think we underrate how much television has changed politics, because that whole sort of community thing that I was talking about, once you have television, that sort of disappears.
And stay at home. And
you stay at home. And you have this face, you know, that is talking to you. But it's not the same thing as somebody who's, you know, third in command. Your sister knows, and you can go down and get something done. You know? And that's a huge difference.
In an evolution from there, where do you see the internet as being more of the same as far as that goes, or do you think that the internet has the possibility to turn it back to that community-based organizing?
I went on the internet. I had started putting out email news updates in '94, and went on the internet in '95. Well, I had a website in '95, and I went with a tremendous amount of optimism. And there were a few things that happened at that time which supported that optimism. For example, it didn't get much attention, but somebody gave a lot of the colleges money to go on the internet to help in the anti-apartheid movement. And it was very important in that. It was underrated, but it was very important, because it made it possible for students on the East Coast to find out what the students on the West Coast were doing. At that time, there was basically no other way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was exciting. And then there was another case of Boris Yeltsin locking up a labor leader, internationally known labor leader in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And people all over the world started calling up the police department because they put out the number on the internet. That was
nice.
one of the early times they'd done it. And you thought, well, my God, if this can happen, what else can happen? Well, it didn't work out that way. It was interesting. I saw somebody from, I think it was Apple, saying the same thing, that the expectations had been so much higher. And I think, for all, any of us may love the internet, we have to admit that we've moved to the right since the internet was started.
Mm-hmm.
And now that doesn't mean there's necessarily a correlation, but it also means that the internet didn't save our souls. So I think that's very important. And I think part of the answer is that you have to think about the internet as a tool
Mm-hmm.
and not as the center of existence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, has become hard for us. If you think about organizing using the internet, and I think when I think about it, I think of Move On as being an example.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, what do you want? You want money,
Mm-hmm.
and you want people to sign a petition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not very effective organizing. And look at what's happened to marches since the internet has come on.
Yeah, they've evaporated.
So I think that's a real problem. I don't have any answer to it, but I think that it's important that we, even those of us who spend as many hours as I do on it, face up to that.
Well, I mean, I think maybe part of it is that there's so many hours of footage of cats chasing laser pointers on YouTube that,
That's right. Well, that's part of it, but I mean, to me, that's sort of a nice relief. I guess it is that I have a nephew who is from Puerto Rico, and he is the other journalist in the family. He's now has his own Latino sportscasting business. But he started out working for the Hartford Current. And one of the stories they did at that time was, what was the difference between immigrants coming into Connecticut now and say in the earlier period, in the 19th century, early 20th century? And they found two basic differences. And one was the role of the church had changed. The church had been almost like a social service organization, giant social service organization. And the other was the change in politics. That again, I mean, in the early 20th, late 19th century, there's a story about a Democratic committeeman in Boston who used to meet every ship that came in to Boston Harbor and would recruit those people to the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
You see. And those are the sort of things that have sort of slipped out. It's not that people have said, well, forget it. It just sort of gets out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
And every once in a while you see an example of that. The one I love was I went one night to the awards dinner of the D.C. Ward 2 Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I went, but maybe a friend of mine was getting an award. But one of the winners was a social worker, Latina woman from the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I wonder why she's getting this award. Well, the story she told was that when she came here, the only president she knew about was Abraham Lincoln. So she became a Republican. And then she found that Republicans weren't like Abraham Lincoln. And so she became a Democrat. And she said, now when I have a client, I have in my drawer a whole set of Democratic registration forms. And I tell them that if you want to be happy in Washington, you have to register as a Democrat. Well, that would seem strange to a lot of people today, but that's the way cities used to function.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I encounter very often, both out in the real world and online is people who are so cynical about the political process that they feel that nothing they do is ever going to change anything, that they can't have any effect. So why bother?
Why bother? Well, that's why I wrote that book. And it's literally true that I had written the Great American Political Repair Manual, and in the late 90s. And as I went around the country talking about it, I kept running into young people who said, what good does it do? Anything you try to do just gets co-opted. And there was this pessimism. And so that inspired me to write a book which is called Why Bother Getting a Life in a Lockdown Land? And I tried to deal with some of those issues. It's very difficult. I don't think there are any easy answers. The problem is that if you don't bother, then you're sure to lose. If you do bother, you can't guarantee you're going to win. And the other thing is to have a sense of enough control over your life so that what you say and what you do matters. And this is basically a basic philosophical belief of existentialists, one of whom said that even a condemned man has a choice of how to approach the gallows. And if you think of life in those terms, rather than saying, well, I don't want to do that because it will probably fail, sure, it probably will on a statistical basis. But you have to remember that on one day, a dozen young blacks sat in at a counter in the South. And within 6 months, there had been demonstrations in 25 cities. That first demonstration was totally unpredictable. And I've seen that over and over and over again in politics, where you think well, that's the end of that. And then something happens. I had a personal experience along these lines that I told you earlier about Julius Hobson, the activist. And D.C. Didn't have a vote for a long time. And we finally, first of all, got a non-voting delegate in the House, which we still have. And Julius decided to run. So a group of us were sitting around in the church basement. After a little while, Julius says, well, what am I going to run on? And we talked about it for a bit. And then somebody said, well, Sam wrote this article about how D.C. should become the 51st state. And this was about 6 months earlier. I'd written this article. The only response I'd gotten to the article was that somebody sent me $5 and said, if anything happens, do something. Well, we sat around that church basement, and we talked for maybe 15 minutes, and Julia says, that's it. That's what I'm going to run on. It just blew me off my chair. And that was the beginning of the whole D.C. statehood movement. Well, it hasn't been successful, but that is how change really happens. The other example I like to use is of the Seneca Falls Conference, where 300 people met to discuss women's issues. It was the first women's conference in the history of America in 1840, I believe. Only 1 or 2 of those women lived long enough to vote. And the question I would ask students and young people who had given up on politics said, would you have gone to that conference if you had been invited? Or would you have said it wasn't worth it? Would you have been willing to be a gay activist in the late 19th century? Would you have been willing to be a labor organizer in the early 19th century? Or would you have said, why bother? And that's the reality of it. I don't kid, it is frustrating and it's depressing. But the alternative is certainly no better.
So the sit-in on its own didn't end segregation.
No.
Yeah.
No, that's right. But that one sit-in just exploded the action. So that, like I said, within 6 months there were demonstrations in 25 cities. And there's no way those young people could have imagined that would have happened that effectively. Because most of the time it doesn't. You know, I mean, I tell people lots of time, I'm just drawing pictures of animals on the Alaska caves of our time.
So I understand that you have an anthropological approach to politics. Gary Ruskin talked to me about that. Could you explain what that is?
Well, that was nice of him to say that. Well, I majored in anthropology. I was blessed by going to one of the 2 high schools in the country that offered an anthropology course, and believe it or not, in 9th grade. And the teacher was so good, and it was so interesting that when I got to Harvard, there were 20 undergraduate anthropology students, and 5 of them came from my high school. So how's that for the influence of one teacher? I didn't do very well in anthropology. I mean, I remember Cora Dubois wrote on my piece on the Nagas of India that this is pretty good journalism, but it's bad anthropology. But I found in a very unself-conscious way that as I covered things that I was using sort of an anthropological approach. I wasn't playing by the normal rules of journalism.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to look behind that and see what the culture was up to and how, how people were behaving and how they were reacting to things. And I've written 4 books, and each of them unconsciously had a chapter which could be said was sort of anthropological. And so that is pretty impressive shows what an effect Mr. Platt had on me.
We were talking earlier about cynicism, and this is one thing that I try to tackle as the punk patriot. And I always keep getting like comments posted like, "Oh, it's not gonna matter," or whatever. Why? It's the why bother thing. And I think like that the solution to that is just making people aware of what success stories there are. Do you have any favorite success stories that you were involved with personally?
Well, I think the civil rights movement was one. I mean, that was pretty dramatic.
Yeah, it was okay.
Certainly, I mean, I covered a lot of them. I mean, if you go back, you'll find pretty early stories on gay rights and on. I ran a story of a woman who had what was then an illegal abortion, describing it. And I did early environmental stuff, and you never know whether a writer is any help or not. But then again, you don't know a lot of times whether the politicians are any help or not either. So you just do. It just happens to be the thing that I do. I would say that the most disappointing thing that I have spent 40 years writing about, and is only just now seeming to change, is that I have been an opponent of the war on drugs from the get-go. And for a lot of reasons, a lot having to do with covering local Washington and seeing what was going on there and how it was functioning. But now, for the first time, I have a sense that something's beginning to happen when you have Vincent Fox, the former president of Mexico, calling for drug legalization, when you have what's going on in California. So I think we are moving on that one, but it's a little slower than I'd hoped.
As a founding member of the Green Party, can you talk, like, what did the Green Party come out of? What inspired that?
The Green Party came out of, it was really in Europe and Germany, I think the roots were. My own, I was following all that, and I was following what was going on at the state level because we didn't have any national group. And I knew that there were things going on in Maine and a few other places. So one day in 1993, I get a call from John Rensenbrinken, who was then, I think, still teaching at Bowdoin. And he says, "We're going to have a meeting of Greens here in Brunswick and I'd like to have you come up and join us." And I said, "Well, John, I'm not good enough to be a Green." And he said, "Well, that's all right. We're going to have a Libertarian here, too." So that's when I became the unofficial chair of what I call the Big Mac Caucus of the Green Party.
The Big what caucus?
The Big Mac caucus.
Oh.
The people who by nature and really shouldn't be in the Green Party, but are. And I've sort of tried to play that role. Haven't been kicked out. But it has left me a little bit at odds at times with the trend of the party. For example, the emphasis on presidential races, I never bought into. I thought that was a mistake. And the reason was that if you look back on the history of third parties back to the 19th century, the progressives and the socialists and the populists, they had one chance of doing something at the presidential level. But the real power came from the grassroots organizing. At one point, I think the populists had something like 10,000 people out on the road, organizing. And we tend to think about socialists as not being important in this country, but they were tremendously important. They had all sorts of influence on our society. And as late as 1960, the mid-1960s, Milwaukee still had a socialist mayor. But my thinking, I came to call myself a backyard green. And my thinking was that you want to emphasize the local and build a sort of a viral and and what that does is it tends to produce change in ways that are not necessarily predictable. For example, the populists getting things like the income tax through, or a directly elected Senate. Now, I think the Greens are moving a little bit this direction. If you look at their latest platform, I was quite impressed by the new platform because it has things, including one of my favorite economic issues, which is a limit on credit card usury, which I think would be a great issue to push, because who's against it unless you work for a credit card company. The Greens haven't done anywhere near as well as I've hoped, but I still think there's a lot of potential, and I think again it goes back to creating more of a sense of community. And we're living in a terrible time, and to my mind, the first American Republic is over. The kindest thing I can say about what we have now is an adhocracy, and it may be worse than that.
What do you mean by an adhocracy?
Well, anything can happen. It's just a matter of power. I mean, the other way you can, a more nasty way to call it, is proto-fascist, and I think you can make a fairly good case that we're moving in that direction. So then you say, well, what are the restrictions against that? What holds that back? And I'll give you an example. I was talking to a Hungarian-American woman who lives in the state here. And she was talking about going back to Hungary and seeing her mother. How her mother said that even during the Cold War in their village, things were run democratically. And we tend to forget that. If you go back and you read 1984, and only 10% of the people in that book, in that world, lived the life that was largely described in 1984. The rest were the proles. And they lived essentially like 1940s England, except the police came through from time to time. And I think we're very much in the same sort of situation. We have to think in kind of a bi-level way, that whatever the evil is at the top level, there is still the potential for doing right at the local level. And it may not be permanent, it may not be consistent, but we're blessed by the fact that the people who want to destroy us tend to want to live in large cities, right? And they want to control power. So if you're in a situation that doesn't reflect power, then you have a lot more freedom. And I think it's important to recognize it and use it as a tool for organizing. And I think Maine has done it its whole history. It hasn't said so, but the whole sense of independence that the state has. And largely, part of the benefit, part of the reason for this is that Maine's been left alone. I mean, you'd be surprised how little people know about Maine elsewhere in the country.
I lived in Texas for a while, and people would ask me, well, first off, because of my accent, people would ask me if I was from England, which was like, I don't sound that British.
Yeah.
But then I would say, oh no, I'm from Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh, is that in upstate New York? No. Yeah, they didn't even know where it was. So, yeah.
And I think it's also very important for Greens and progressives generally to understand the importance of the local. It's been, especially now that the right has gotten onto the 10th Amendment and is somewhat misusing it.
Mm-hmm.
The fact of the matter is the 10th Amendment is very, very important, that what is not in the Constitution given to the federal government belongs to the states and the people.
Mm-hmm.
And what progressives and Greens and liberals need to understand is if you look at the polling, people trust their local and state government much more than they do the federal government. Now, that might not be completely fair, but there's a fairly solid reason for that.
And, well, you can go down and knock on their door.
That's
and
right. That's right.
Say howdy.
That's right. And so I think it's very important that a new progressive politics emphasizes the local and how to use it. I mean, if we can have local lettuce, we can have local democracy too. Right?
Certainly.
But it has to be at least as important as local lettuce.
Today, August 10th, Press Secretary Gibbs told basically the progressive movement in an article with The Hill, basically to go suck it. And he said, progressives will be satisfied when we have Canadian health care and when we've eliminated the Pentagon. That's not reality. They wouldn't be satisfied if Dennis Kucinich was president. And he also went on to say that people who are upset with Obama's performance should be drug tested. So I'm just going to go through a quick list right here. Guantanamo Bay is still open. The USA Patriot Act is still on the books. Wall Street is still cooking up gambling schemes. We're still in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the executive office claims authority to assassinate United States citizens. Do any of these upset you?
Well, during the election, I rounded up about 30 reasons why progressives shouldn't be happy with Obama.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't very popular, even in my household.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to sort of deal with the cultural problem is when people have hope and faith, they can ignore a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
There were things that as a reporter just didn't seem right. You don't move from state senator to president without having done something.
Mm-hmm.
Normally. And so it said to me that this is somebody who somebody's using,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the other way around. And I think that is scary. I think Gibbs's comments are remarkable in that, and very, very telling, because try to find him saying something similar about the right and you won't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, almost everything that Obama says about the Republicans and the right is sort of conciliatory.
Mm-hmm.
But this is almost trying to throw them overboard.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it doesn't make any difference because it's what I expected. But but I have to be honest too and say that I also think that there's beginning to be talk about Hillary Clinton becoming vice president in the second term, and I think that would be incredibly dangerous. I ran a piece the other day in which I listed some of the problems with Hillary Clinton that people seem to have forgotten about.
Mm-hmm.
The number of her friends who are imprisoned or got in trouble in one way or another. The 35 times she was mentioned in Webster Hubbell's indictment, the little things like that. But then also I supported John Edwards, and he didn't turn out all that hot either. So we basically had a hat trick of disaster in the last election.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens this time around for the Democrats, one of the things I would argue is that you look for someone, and I just throw this name out just as an example, he's so little known that his name slips my mind, the governor of Montana. Brian,
The guy who said sometimes the federal government has to go screw itself.
yeah, the guy who stood up on Real ID
Yeah.
and on a number of other issues.
I can't remember his name.
And he has very high popularity rating, you see. And to my mind, from a political point of view, if you want to win in 2012, you probably won't do it with Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And whether he will still try or not remains to be seen. But a more rational approach would be to look for someone, a governor who has good popularity, who's from a state which is best of all in flyover country, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, keep it out of the the liberal stereotype,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and try that approach, but that won't happen. And so, but I think the Greens are really important now because, like I say, I covered Washington for over 50 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I have never seen a time in which there are so few halfway admirable people in that town. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich, and then you have to think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that isn't the way it should be.
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to us now.
Mm-hmm.
And if there is going to be a remake of America for the better, it's going to come from the bottom up. It's not going to come from Obama who you elect, and it just doesn't work like that anymore.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you very much for coming in
Thank you.
and
Enjoyed
doing
it.
this interview today. The books are Why Bother? Getting a Life in a Lockdown Land, and Great American Political Repair Manual. And I'm going to warn you, there may be a jump in sales because literally tens of people watch my show.